Hello and welcome to this episode of my tutorial video series. The subject of this video is macroeconomics and the topic is theory of demand. Basically, this is part 3 of theory of demand. In my earlier videos, we have discussed what is demand, what are the factors that influence demand, what is law of demand and demand function in part 1 of theory of demand, and price elasticity of demand in part 2. In this video, we shall discuss cross elasticity of demand. The elasticity can be of 4 types: price elasticity, cross elasticity, income elasticity, and elasticity of substitution. This part we have completed in part 2 of theory of demand, and in this episode, that is part 3, we shall discuss cross elasticity of demand, and in another video we shall discuss income elasticity and elasticity of substitution. So this video is confined to discussion of cross elasticity of demand. Okay. Yeah. Now, in price elasticity of demand, we have related the change in quantity demanded with change in price. That is, price elasticity of demand, or commonly written as ED, is the proportionate change or percentage change in quantity demanded divided by proportionate or percentage change in price. That is, change in quantity is related with change in price. Now, what is cross elasticity? In cross elasticity, price of one commodity is related to quantity demanded of another commodity. Now, what is meant by the word another commodity? The another commodity is a related commodity. That is, it is either a complementary good or a substitute commodity of the commodity in question. That means, if X and Y are related commodities, that is either complementary or substitute, then how quantity demanded of commodity X is related to price of Y. That is, how the change in quantity demanded of commodity X is related to change in price of another commodity Y is called cross elasticity of demand. Okay, I am erasing this part and explaining what is cross elasticity of demand. In this video, I shall discuss what is cross elasticity of demand, how cross elasticity of demand is measured, and how the movement of the consumer takes place between two equilibrium points as regards price elasticity of demand, that is when price of the commodity changes, and as regards cross elasticity of demand, that is when price of another related commodity changes. Okay, so cross elasticity of demand, cross elasticity of demand is equal to responsiveness of quantity demanded of commodity X as a result of change in price of another commodity Y when X and Y are either substitute or complementary goods. Correct? Now let us understand how the quantity demanded of one commodity is related to price of another commodity when the commodities are either substitute or complementary. In case of substitute commodities, that is, say for example tea and coffee, if price of coffee increases, then quantity demanded of tea will also rise. If price of coffee increases, quantity demanded of tea also rises. Why? Because tea and coffee are substitute commodities and a consumer can, with reasonable degree of satisfaction, can substitute tea for coffee or coffee for tea. So when the price of coffee is increasing, the consumer will decrease consumption of coffee and increase consumption of tea because he can easily substitute tea for coffee. Correct? In the same way, if price of coffee falls, then quantity demanded of tea also falls, because as price of coffee falls, when price of tea remains constant, then the consumer will purchase more coffee, he will consume more coffee relative to tea, because price of coffee has become relatively cheaper compared to tea. This is the mechanism of price quantity between two substitute goods. Correct? On the other hand, when two commodities are complementary to each other, say for example petrol and car, if price of petrol increases, demand for car will fall, and if price of petrol falls, demand for car will increase. Why? If this is substitutes and this is complementary, if price of petrol or fuel, whatever, petrol or diesel, whatever it may be, price of petrol increases, quantity demanded of car will come down. If price of petrol increases, then the consumers will find running a car more expensive. So quantity demanded for car will fall. On the other hand, if price of petrol falls, petrol becomes relatively cheaper than earlier. then quantity demanded of car will increase. So you can see the reverse mechanism is happening in case of complementary goods compared to substitute goods. In case of substitute commodities, if price of one commodity increases, quantity demanded of the substitute commodity increases. That is, when price of coffee increases, quantity demanded of tea will also increase. When price of coffee falls, quantity demanded of tea will also fall. The reverse mechanism takes place in case of complementary goods. Say for example, relation between petrol and car. Now petrol and car are complementary goods because they are used jointly. So if price of petrol increases, it becomes more expensive to run a car. So quantity demanded of car will fall. Correct? On the other hand, if price of petrol falls, running a car will be cheaper related to earlier days. As a result, demand for car will also rise. So these two reverse mechanisms work in case of substitute goods and complementary goods. Right? Now, mathematically, now I am erasing this part so that I can proceed further. Okay? I am erasing this part. Yeah. Now the board is clear. I can proceed further. Now mathematically, it is also called cross price, same thing, cross price or cross elasticity or cross price elasticity. Equals to percentage change in quantity demanded of X divided by percentage change in price of Y. Correct? This is equal to delta QX by QX, that is change in quantity of X divided by original quantity of X, whole divided by delta PY by PY, that is equal to delta QX by QX into PY by delta PY, that is equal to delta QX by delta PY into PY by QX. Right? Delta QX is change in quantity demanded of X, QX is original quantity demanded of X, delta PY is change in price of Y, PY is original price of Y, and the cross elasticity is delta QX by QX divided by delta PY by PY, that comes to delta QX by delta PY into PY by QX. Okay. Now in case of substitute goods, if price of X increases, price of Y increases, then quantity demanded of X will also increase, because the consumer can substitute one commodity for another. So if price of Y increases, consumer will shift to commodity X, so quantity demanded of commodity X will rise. So in case of substitute goods, elasticity is positive. Elasticity is greater than 0. Correct? Because price of X and quantity of price of Y and quantity of X are moving in the same direction. If Py increases, Qx increases. If Py falls, Qx falls. So change in price of Y and change in quantity demanded of X move in the same direction if the goods are substitute goods. That is, when price of Y increases, quantity demanded of price of Y increases, quantity demanded of X also increases. When price of Y falls, quantity demanded of X also falls. So cross elasticity is greater than 0. And in case of complementary goods, what is happening? If X and Y are not substitutes, they are complementary goods, then if Py increases, price of Y increases, quantity demanded of X will fall. Say Y is petrol, X is car. Price of petrol is increasing, so quantity demanded of car will fall. And if Py falls, price of Y falls, Qx increases, that is, if price of petrol falls, quantity demanded of car will increase. So you can see that in case of complementary goods, the price of one commodity and the quantity demanded of another commodity are inversely related, isn't it? Here they are positively related and here they are negatively related. So here EC is less than 0. But as we know, for all practical purposes, we ignore the signs. Whether it is positive or negative hardly makes any difference when we solve out problems. But theoretically, in case of substitute goods, EC is greater than 0, and in case of complementary goods, EC is less than 0. Okay. Now we will draw two diagrams to see how the movement of the consumer, that is, how the consumer moves from one equilibrium point to another equilibrium point when there is change in price of the commodity and when there is change in price of another commodity. Correct? It will be well to remember that the consumer always wants to maximize his satisfaction. When the price of a commodity is falling, the consumer is consuming more of the commodity in order to achieve maximum satisfaction. So whatever the consumer is consuming keeping in mind that maximization of satisfaction is his ultimate motive of consumption. Correct? So I am erasing this part to draw two diagrams. Okay? Yeah. Say this is the demand curve. D dash is the demand curve. On x-axis we measure quantity and on y-axis we measure price. Say the consumer is purchasing OQ1 units at OP1 price. This means that the consumer is maximizing his satisfaction by consuming OP1 units when the price of the commodity is OP1 per unit. And his total expenditure is the area of this rectangle. Say this is point T. So the consumer is at point T when he is consuming OP1 units at OP1 price per unit. So his total expenditure is equal to the area of the rectangle OP1 TQ1. And at point T, the consumer is deriving maximum satisfaction. Now suppose price of the commodity falls to P2 without any change in income of the consumer and prices of other commodities and other factors that influence quantity demand, that is tastes, preferences, etc. So when price falls to P2, the consumer is shifting to say point R and he is consuming say OQ2 units. So the consumer has moved down the demand curve from point T to point R. And here at point R, the consumer is maximizing his satisfaction by consuming OQ2 units at OP2 price per unit. And his total expenditure is area of this rectangle, that is OP2 or OQ2. Correct? Now you see, when there is only change in price, all other factors remaining constant, that is income of the consumer, prices of the related commodities, that is price of substitute good, price of complementary good, tastes, preferences, everything remain constant. If only price changes, the consumer moves along the same demand curve. The consumer is moving along the same demand curve. Correct? This is called movement along same demand curve. Only price of the commodity changes, all other factors remaining constant. Correct? Now Let me draw another diagram. On x-axis we measure quantity and on y-axis we measure price, and let D dash be the demand curve. Suppose the consumer is consuming OQ1 units at OP1 price, and he is deriving the maximum satisfaction by consuming that commodity. Now, suppose this commodity, say this is commodity A. It has a substitute commodity B, correct? Say this is tea, this is coffee. Now if price of that substitute commodity, say coffee, say this is tea, price of substitute commodity falls, then what will happen? The consumer will consume more coffee and will reduce consumption of tea as price of coffee has fallen. As price of coffee has fallen, if price of coffee falls, if price of B falls, the consumer will consume more of B, that is more of coffee and less of tea. If price of B falls, consumption of A will also fall, isn't it? So in that case, the demand curve will shift parallelly to the left. So new demand curve will be say MN. You see, the consumer is consuming lesser quantity even though the price has remained unchanged. Now he is consuming OQ2 units of that commodity at the same price. Why? Because price of coffee has fallen and the consumer has shifted his consumption towards coffee. As a result, his consumption of tea has fallen. So he will be purchasing lesser amount of tea even at the same price. So there will be a leftward shift of demand curve. A parallel leftward shift of the demand curve. So in case of substitute commodities, if price of substitute commodity falls, then the demand curve for that commodity will shift parallelly left and the consumer will be consuming less of the commodity at the same price. So here you see, initially the consumer was in equilibrium at this point. That is, the consumer was equilibrium in the sense that the consumer is deriving maximum satisfaction, because that is the motive of the rational consumer. So previously the consumer was at this point, say this is point S. Now the consumer has moved to point, say, U. Now you see, this movement has taken place in a different demand curve. D dash was the original demand curve. Now the consumer has moved to a different demand curve, Mn. Correct? Here we saw that the movement takes place in the same demand curve. This is called movement along the same demand curve. And here we see the movement has taken place in another demand curve. So the consumer has shifted from one demand curve to another demand curve. Put in a different way, the consumer has shifted his equilibrium point from one demand curve to another point in another demand curve. Correct? And if price of coffee increases, if price of B, the considered coffee, if price of B increases, what will happen? Since A and B are substitute commodities, the consumers will reduce consumption of B and increase consumption of A. So if price of B increases, consumption of A will rise. So when price of B increases, the consumer will shift to another demand curve, say this one. Say this is KL. This is a new demand curve, KL. And the consumer will be at this point of the new demand curve. You see, the consumer is consuming more of the commodity. Say this is Q3. At the same price P1, that is no change in price. So the movement has taken place to a different demand curve, and KL is parallel to DD dash. That means the demand curve has shifted parallelly rightward. Correct? And for complementary goods, let this be the original demand curve, say AB. On x-axis we measure quantity and on y-axis we measure price. So AB is the original demand curve, say of commodity. Commodity, say commodity A, let it be petrol. Correct? Now if price of car increases, the people will reduce purchase of car. That means demand for car will fall if price of car increases, so demand for car will fall. As a result, demand for petrol will also fall. So if price of car increases, demand is taking much space. Let me write it in short. If price of car increases, demand for petrol will fall, because demand for car will fall. As a result, demand for petrol will also fall. So suppose this was the price and this was the quantity. Okay, and this is commodity, petrol is the commodity in this diagram. Now if price of car increases, demand for petrol will fall. So as a result, the demand curve will shift parallelly leftward. Let CD be the new demand curve. The consumer was at this point, say M, by consuming OQ1 units. Here it is petrol, and as a result of increase in price of car, demand for petrol will fall. So the consumer will now purchase lesser amount of petrol even at the same price. That is, now he is purchasing OQ2 units of petrol, even though price of petrol has not increased. Correct? Say this is point N. So you see, the movement takes place from demand curve. The demand curve is shifting from AB to CD, that is leftward parallelly, and the movement happens from M to point N in between different demand curves. Correct? If price of car falls, demand for petrol will increase. Demand for petrol will increase, because if price of car falls, demand for car will increase. As a result of increase in demand for car, demand for petrol will also increase. So if price of car falls, the demand curve of petrol will shift parallelly rightward. Say this is UV. Lines are not drawn up to scales and using scales. No diagram is drawn up to scale, and I am not using scales, so consider these lines are parallel. So UV is the new demand curve, and the consumer is, say, at this point. So now the consumer is consuming, say this is OQ3. Even though there is no change in price of petrol. So here movement takes place from this point to this point, and here it was leftward shift and this is the rightward shift of demand curve. Correct? So this is movement along demand curve and these are shift in the demand curves. When price of a commodity changes, other factors remaining same, then movement along the demand curve is said to have taken place, and when price of the commodity remains unchanged, in both the cases we have considered that price of the commodity under discussion is remaining unchanged. Only price of substitute commodity and complementary commodity are changing. In that case, when price is held constant, in those cases the demand curve will shift either rightward or leftward depending upon whether the commodity is substitute or complementary and whether the price of the substitute or complementary commodity is increasing or decreasing. Correct? So what we have learned in this video, you learned what is cross elasticity of demand. Cross elasticity of demand means proportionate change in quantity demanded of one commodity divided by proportionate change in price of another commodity, and that another commodity must be a substitute commodity or a complementary commodity. In case of substitute goods, when price of a substitute commodity increases, the quantity demanded of that commodity also increases. That is, when price of tea increases, quantity demanded of coffee also increases. When price of tea falls, quantity demanded of coffee also falls. These are substitute commodities. And in case of complementary goods, say for example petrol and car, when price of a complementary commodity increases, then quantity demanded of the commodity falls. Say for example, if price of car increases, then quantity demanded of car will fall. As a result, quantity demanded of petrol will also fall. So the mechanism works in a reverse way in between complementary good and substitute good. When there is only change in price of the commodity, other factors remaining constant, then the consumer moves along the same indifference curve, moves along the same demand curve, and when the price of the commodity is held constant and prices of related commodities, either substitute or complementary, change, then the demand curve altogether shifts either rightward or leftward, and the movement of the consumer takes place in a different demand curve, unlike in these cases where the movement takes place on the same demand curve. So this is movement along the demand curve and this is shift in demand curve. Shift in demand curve. Correct? Okay, so this is all about cross elasticity of demand, and this is part 3 of theory of demand. In part 1 I have discussed what is demand, what are the factors that influence demand, what is law of demand, what are the exceptions to the law of demand, and the demand function. And in part 2 I have discussed what is price elasticity of demand, what are the different shapes of demand curves, what is linear demand curve, what is curvilinear demand curve, correct? How the value of elasticity, price elasticity is calculated. Okay. And in this part, that is in part 3, I have discussed cross elasticity of demand and the movement of the consumer either along the demand curve when there is only change in price of the commodity, and shift of demand curve when there is change in price of a related commodity. Now this shift of demand curve can also take place when there is change in income of the consumer or change in taste and preference of the consumer. That we shall discuss in the next episode. In the next episode, we shall discuss income elasticity of demand and elasticity of substitution. Correct? What is income elasticity? Income elasticity is the responsiveness of quantity demanded as a result of change in income, that is proportionate change in quantity demanded divided by proportionate change in income. And what is elasticity of substitution? This is proportionate change in ratio of the commodities consumed divided by proportionate change in marginal rate of substitution. Remember, elasticity of substitution has nothing to do with price changes, because that measures the relationship between change in the ratio of the commodities consumed, ratio of the quantities of the commodities consumed with respect to change in marginal rate of substitution. Anyway, income elasticity and elasticity of substitution will be taken care of in some other video. In this video, we have discussed what is cross elasticity of demand, and this is enough for this video. Okay. I hope you have enjoyed this video. I mean to say, this video has benefited you, and if you think that this video has really benefited you, please do like our channel, please do subscribe our channel, and also if you have any query, any question, please feel comfortable to ask me through the comment box. I shall try my level best to respond to all your queries. I mean all the relevant queries, of course. Okay, and thank you very much for watching this video. Wish you all the best. Goodbye.